Once upon a time, there was a very wealthy country whose GDP accounted for nearly 1/10 of the world's economy. Its largest city was the world's financial capital, full of bankers and traders and foreign investors. Its scientists and engineers were among the world's most innovative, creating technologies that changed the way that people lived and worked. It had the world's strongest navy, which traveled freely across oceans to every corner of the globe. It had a very powerful army, which it sent out to faraway places to protect its interests, and it dispatched its diplomats to negotiate peace treaties. Its economic system, capitalism, its language, English, and even its fashion styles, they set the standard for how people lived or aspired to live around the world. So which country am I talking about? Well, I'll give you a hint. It's not the United States. This was Great Britain at the height of the British Empire in the late 19th century and the early 20th century. Today, it might seem quaint to be talking about a world dominated by the British Empire. But for those of us accustomed to thinking of the United States as the undisputed leader of the international system, it's worth remembering that countries rise and countries fall, and there is nothing inevitable or necessarily enduring about a US-led global order. Today, of course, the biggest challenger to the US-led order is China. So how will China affect the world in the next 20 years? Well, political scientists were notoriously bad at predictions. But if current trends continue, this unipolar moment, this world we've all been living in since the end of the Cold War, in which the United States is the sole superpower, this world might be coming to a close as China takes its seat closer to the head of the international table. So how did we get here? Well, we can trace China's economic rise back just about 25 years ago. China's GDP was going along, and then pop. In 1993, China's GDP was about $445 billion. Last year, it was about $12.2 trillion. It increased 27 times. Those numbers are huge, and I know that they're really hard to understand. So it might be helpful to think a little bit about how they compare to the United States. Back in 1993, the US economy was 15 times as big as China's. But today, it's only about 1.5 times as big. And these changes in China, they're palpable. Back in 2000, when I first started going to China, people on bicycles rode 4 or 5 across in these special lanes next to the main roads. But a decade later, as a growing middle class caused the number of car owners to skyrocket, the cars took over. And when I rode my bike through the streets of Beijing, I had to dodge cars that were parked in what had once been those dedicated bike lanes. And sometimes, even if I was just walking down the sidewalk, I had to sidestep a car that was parked haphazardly in my way. This stunning growth has propelled China towards much greater global influence. And I'm sure that's something you've heard a whole bunch, that China's influence is growing. Well, how do we know? One big indicator is China's increased membership in international organizations. Back in the 1980s, China really wasn't a member of all that many international organizations. But then it went on a bit of a joining spree. It joined big organizations that I'm sure you've all heard of, like the World Trade Organization. And it joined a whole bunch of teensy-tiny organizations that you've probably never heard of, like Partners in Population and Development, which advises developing countries on their demographic policies. By joining all these organizations, China gained the ability to guide their policies and their programs. And it didn't just join organizations. At the same time, China became much more active in international organizations, both the ones it had just joined and the ones it had been a member of for many decades. At the United Nations, for example, China increasingly used its veto power to influence resolutions. For example, recent resolutions have had a lot of watered-down language, resolutions on countries like North Korea and Iran. And what's interesting is that China doesn't even have to veto the resolutions. Just the threat of a veto alone has been enough to water down that language. Another sign of China's growing influence is its social reach. Back in 2004, China's Ministry of Education introduced the first Confucius Institutes, which funds students studying Chinese language and culture at universities around the world. Today, there are hundreds of these institutes scattered across the 6 inhabited continents, and there are about 100 of them in the United States alone. These institutes have already reached millions of students. By encouraging students' fascination with China, these institutes extend China's soft power, its ability to persuade others to follow its lead. And while they play a very important role in increasing cultural understanding, some worry that they also provide an avenue for the Chinese leadership to advance its own positions on very controversial topics, like the status of Taiwan and human rights. But it's not just China's capabilities that we need to evaluate. We also need to assess its intentions. What is it that China wants? And here, too, we can see that China's ambitions are growing. When China first re-engaged with the outside world, after years of chaos and turmoil and isolation under Chairman Mao, it saw itself as the leader of the developing world. And it thought that it could guide the countries of the developing world, what was then called the Third World, along the path to prosperity. As China's economic rise took off, it turned its attention to its wealthier neighbors, to South Korea and to Japan, countries that have very close ties to the United States. And its focus shifted towards building a peaceful and stable neighborhood to ensure a good environment for its domestic economic growth. But the global financial crisis of 2008 and 2009, it really shook things up. As the impact of the US disaster ricocheted across the world, Chinese analysts began to vocally question the legitimacy of American-style capitalism. The once mighty United States was still strong, but perhaps not invulnerable. And the Chinese leadership, they noticed. Increasingly, Chinese analysts started to talk about China not as a rising power, but as a country that has already risen, and which is now entitled to claim much greater authority over the international system. Last fall, Chinese President Xi Jinping gave a 3.5-hour speech at the National Party Congress. 3.5 hours, that's a lot. And in that speech, he announced that China is now beginning a new era that will see it move closer to center stage. And he promised that China will continue to play its part as a major and responsible country and will take a part in reforming and developing the global governance system. Xi's vision of China is of a country that will rewrite the rules of the international system and that will take an increasingly important role in governing international affairs. Chinese leaders foresee the creation of a new world order, one that's grounded in principles like transparency, egalitarianism, and the greater empowerment of the developing world. And they argue that this new world order stands in sharp contrast to what they see as an existing US-led order characterized by hierarchy and elitism. Already, we can see examples of China taking a much more active role in managing regional and global affairs. In 2013, Xi announced the creation of the Belt and Road Initiative that are a series of Chinese-funded infrastructure projects that connect China to Eurasia, to South Asia, and to Southeast Asia through the construction of railroads and highways, shipping ports, and airports. As trade expands along these corridors, China's ties to these countries will expand as well, potentially to the detriment of those countries' ties to the United States. In 2016, China announced the creation of the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, which funds large-scale development projects around the world. China has a huge amount of influence over this bank, even though it's attracted a number of very important Western partners, like the United Kingdom, Germany, and France. The bank is headquartered in Beijing, and it's headed by a Chinese banker. Initially, some observers worried that the bank would provide China with a way to sidestep inconvenient regulations regarding transparency and the environment that accompany funding from the World Bank and the Asian Development Bank. And so far, those fears seem to be unfounded. But by creating and leading such an important organization, China has gained the ability to steer international funding towards its preferred projects, and it's also shown the world what its leadership capabilities really are. Likewise, China has taken an increasingly vocal role in addressing global climate change, especially as the United States announced its intention to withdraw from the Paris Climate Accord. In that 3.5-hour speech, she said that China is taking a driving seat in international cooperation to respond to climate change. Now, these changes in Chinese behavior, they don't happen in a vacuum. The United States' global posture has changed rather dramatically under the current administration, as the United States shifts away from the assertive leadership position that it's held under the various administrations since World War II, towards a more inwardly focused and transactional approach. And as the United States withdraws, Chinese leaders see an opening to assert their global authority and to start reshaping the international system in a way that will advance their interests. The next US administration, whether it's elected in 2020 or 2024, is likely to shift the United States back towards that more involved position. But it's not clear that the United States can just get things back to the way they used to be. China is taking its seat at the table, and it won't vacate just because the United States decides it wants to be in charge again. Now, I told you that political scientists are terrible at predictions, and I wouldn't be a true political scientist if I didn't caution you that none of this might happen. This might all be wrong, right? China's economic growth is the source of its international influence. And if that growth falters, then its global influence might falter as well. And in fact, what we see is that China's GDP growth is starting to slow from annual rates of 9% or more per year, starting in the early 2000s, down to rates of about 7% in more recent years. In fact, we've been down this road before. In the 1980s, Japan looked poised to be the next big thing, as its economy took off and its investors bought up properties around the world. In the early 1990s, my elementary school here in the suburbs of Chicago started teaching us all Japanese to prepare us for this new world that was coming. It never happened. Japan's economy sank into a prolonged recession, and its global ambitions remained stymied. I switched from Japanese to Chinese. The dangers of an economic slowdown are even greater for China. Chinese leaders' ability to ensure rapid domestic economic growth has long been central to the Chinese Communist Party's ability to maintain its power. But if people see that their lives are no longer improving, they might start to question the legitimacy of authoritarian power in their country. And domestic troubles would distract the Chinese leadership from its global role. So we don't know exactly what the next 20 years will bring us. But even a quick look at history tells us this. A US-led global order, it's not the natural state of the world. It's just the way things have been ever since the United States and its allies reconstituted the international system after the horrors of World War II, and especially after the end of the Cold War and the fall of the Soviet Union left the United States as the last superpower standing. China has a different vision of what the world order should be, and increasingly, it has the capabilities to implement it. If the United States wants to continue to shape the future of the international order, it needs to stay at the table. Thank you.